Hello, I'm Shirit Langenoven-Heber. Today we are going to be looking at prevalence, which is a very important concept we use when defining a public mental health question or problem. When we are interested in improving health at the population level, we start with defining the problem before we move to the other steps in the public health approach. To define the problem, we need to understand and be able to use a few terms and concepts. We can define the problem by describing the prevalence, incidence, and burden of disease. For now, we will be discussing prevalence. When it comes to chronic health conditions and mental health epi, we have certain aspects of prevalence that are particularly important to describe. So, what do we need to know about prevalence? Well, first, we need to know what it means. Then we should be able to calculate prevalence given certain pieces of information. Then we should think about how to report and show prevalence data. Lastly, we need to think about how to apply the knowledge once we have prevalence data. Let's start with the definition of prevalence, followed by calculating prevalence and interpreting prevalence data. Prevalence is a measure of disease occurrence. It is a measure of how many people in a population have any type of health condition, exposure, or other factor related to health at a given point in time. We express prevalence as the total number of individuals who have the condition or disease, exposure, or attribute, divided by the population who may be at risk of having the condition. The use of the term exposure can be a bit confusing, especially if we are talking about a protective factor, which is generally seen as positive. For example, if we are interested in social support among older adults in South Africa, calling social support an exposure may sound a bit strange, as it is known to be a protective factor for common mental health conditions. However, they are still being exposed to something, which happens to be positive. The use of the term case here may be confusing, as we usually use the term when we are speaking about a diagnosis of a health condition. But we do look at prevalence of other factors as well. We could be looking at the prevalence of any drug use among adolescents, for example. Any drug use could be defined as using any illicit substance in their lifetime. As you can see, prevalence is a proportion, not a rate. In everyday language, we talk about rate when we are talking about the speed at which something occurs. When we express prevalence, as shown here, we are not talking about how often or how fast something occurs. We are merely looking at how many individuals have a condition in a certain population. Another way of thinking about prevalence is to picture the target population as a large circle. So, these are the people who could have the condition, exposure, or other attribute. Let's look at an example. Looking at dementia, we'll say that the population of interest comprises all adults aged 60 and over in South Africa. It's important to be very specific about the numerator. Here we have age and country. We can add a smaller circle inside the larger circle to show the people who actually have the condition, exposure, or attribute. Then in our example, the blue circle represents all those adults aged 60 and over who actually have developed dementia. Back to our calculation. To reiterate, the denominator is the total population who could have a condition, attribute, or exposure. And the numerator is the number of people who actually have the condition or exposure or attribute, sometimes referred to as cases. Back to our example. Here we have 100,000 divided by 5 million, which gives us a dementia prevalence of 0.02 or 2%. When we are talking about prevalence, we also need to think about where and when. In epidemiology, we ask questions about where a condition or exposure occurs and if this differs across different locations. Then we need to think about when. We can think about the prevalence of a condition or exposure at a particular point in time or in a specific time period. For this reason, we have different types of prevalence, namely point prevalence and period prevalence. Point prevalence is the proportion of individuals with a condition at a specific point in time. Period prevalence is the proportion of individuals with a condition at any time during a specified time period or interval, such as over a lifetime or 12 months. In mental health epi, we often speak about current, 12-month, or lifetime prevalence. Mental health conditions are often chronic and relapsing, which means that many people with these conditions live with them over an extended period of time, if not the rest of their lives. Let's look at another example. Say we are interested in the prevalence of anxiety symptoms in school-going adolescents in a county in Kenya. So, our denominator is the whole population at risk, or school-going adolescents aged 13 to 19 years in a county in Kenya during a particular academic year. We have counted all the school-going adolescents in the county, and there are 98,459. Based on a recent school survey using an anxiety symptom screening tool, 18,707 adolescents are experiencing high levels of anxiety symptoms. We often express prevalence as a percentage, and in this case, we find that 19% of the adolescents are experiencing high levels of anxiety symptoms. Let's take another look at the circles as we think about defining the population at risk and making sure we know how to identify the people who have the condition or exposure or attribute. It's very important to be precise about defining the population at risk, the denominator, and the people who have the condition or exposure. Say we are talking about the prevalence of people who engage in heavy drinking in the past month. But we use the figures for the total population of a city, including people of all ages, represented by the green circle. Then we add the blue circle to represent people who are engaging in heavy drinking. The problem doesn't look too bad. But can we say that young children are at risk for heavy drinking at the age of 4? I think we can safely assume that they are not. So this image is misleading. The population at risk does not include young children. So let's reevaluate our denominator. The population at risk for heavy drinking is actually much smaller, shown by the red circle. We'll have to make a call here and estimate the age group we are dealing with. Let's say 14 years and older. Suddenly, the problem looks a lot larger than it did in the previous image. I think we can say that this image has put the problem in perspective. Just as it is very important to think carefully about our denominator, we shouldn't neglect the numerator. Exactly what are we measuring? Different researchers can measure heavy drinking in the same people and get very different figures. It all depends on how they are defining heavy drinking and how they are measuring it. Are they using the United States National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism definition? This definition uses blood alcohol concentration, which can vary by age, size, and gender. For example, if a small woman has 4 or more drinks, she may have a higher blood alcohol concentration than a man who has the same amount of drinks over the same time. But some people use a definition of 5 drinks or more for men and 4 drinks or more for women over a few hours. It could get even more complicated. If you start to consider how often a person would need to have a heavy drinking episode to be part of the numerator, this decision really depends on your study question. Maybe they are using the 5 drinks or more for men and 4 drinks or more for women over a few hours definition. But how often? If you are looking at the prevalence of regular heavy drinking in the past month, how often is regular? Every weekend or at least 2 weekends a month? It's important to be very specific when it comes to defining the numerator so that when someone wants to compare the prevalence across studies, we know what we are comparing. We often need to communicate mental health epi-evidence to a range of different audiences, and we can do this in a few ways. Let's look at another example. Say we collected data for a period of 12 months from women accessing healthcare facilities for antenatal care in Gambia. We screened each of these women with a depression screening tool. Our denominator is 25,413, which is the number of pregnant women accessing care over the 12 months. Our numerator is 9,072, which is the number of women that screened positive or above a cutoff score on a depression screening tool. A bar graph allows us to depict these findings really simply. If we take those numbers, dividing 9,072 by 25,413 and multiplying by 100, we get 35.7% of pregnant women attending antenatal care over 12 months who have high levels of depressive symptoms. We can also show prevalence data in this way, which can be very helpful when talking about data outside academia. You could use this strategy in a non-academic report or presentation or in a social media post. Here we can see the prevalence of current mental health conditions in countries globally, expressed as a percentage of the whole population and displayed on a world map using different colors to show different prevalence proportions. The scale starts at around 9% at bottom left and ends at 19% on the right. In this image, we can see the distribution of mental health conditions and where these conditions are most and least prevalent. Let's move on to finding and using existing prevalence data. We can't always collect our own data as much as we would like to. Sometimes we need to use what is available. Maybe we are looking at the prevalence of a mental health condition in a country, province, or county. Then the primary sources of available denominated data could be the most recent national census data in your country or population registers. If you are interested in prevalence data in primary school children in a certain area, you could use school registration records. It all depends on what your question is. It's very important to remember that we need to access the most reliable data available in order to find the most true answers for our question. Limited, outdated, or poor quality data would affect your prevalence calculations. You need to be careful how you choose your source. For our numerator, we may have various sources of routinely collected data available for use. If you are interested in the prevalence of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in primary school children and their school performance, you could look for national surveys or school records. If you are interested in the number of children attending primary care clinics to collect treatment for ADHD, you could look at the clinic registers or review the clinical notes to identify cases of ADHD attending the clinic. However, we should bear in mind that the availability and quality of these types of data varies considerably across settings. This means that you might not be able to answer your specific question with the available data. And you also need to be aware of the limitations of the data set when you interpret the findings. Sometimes you'll be able to find prevalence data to use without having to do any calculations. Systematic reviews and meta-analysis may be useful, or other sources from institutions involved in collating and analyzing data from multiple sources. In EPI, it's not always possible to assess the whole population of interest. If we were assessing the prevalence of risky alcohol use in adolescents in one small village, we may be able to speak to most, if not all, the young people about their alcohol use. But if we wanted to know the prevalence amongst all young people in a country, then we need to collect data from a representative sample of young people in the country and extrapolate the information to the rest of the population. We use a technique called sampling to identify a representative sample so that the information collected is generalizable to the wider population of interest. We identify geographical areas within the country and then identify households within those areas, and then identify members in a household to recruit for the study. It's important to note that the sampling methods we use depend on the research question and the study design. As I mentioned earlier, in epidemiology, we ask questions about the number of people affected, where condition or exposure occurs, and if this differs across different groups of people. If we were advising policymakers on health budget allocations for different healthcare services, we would consider the number of people in an area affected by different health conditions or exposures. Do we allocate more budget to treating mental health conditions or malaria? It wouldn't make sense to allocate a large portion of the health budget for malaria treatment if malaria cases are very rare in a district. We'll definitely take that budget for mental health care, please. We can also look at human resource distribution and make decisions based on data from the relevant locations. If the Ministry of Health is deciding where to place a counsellor, it's important to decide where, rural or urban, this area or that area. Prevalence data collected in different places can be used to make these decisions. Health budget allocations are also informed by the time frame. We spoke about using point prevalence or period prevalence. If our Ministry of Health official is planning the budget for mental health treatment services in a district for the next 2 years, they may consider collecting or finding data regarding point prevalence or a type of period prevalence, 12-month prevalence, of mental health conditions in the district or country. Lifetime prevalence data can help us advocate for spending on prevention and early treatment. Today we covered the main ideas around prevalence. I hope the most prevalent feelings in the audience of this video at this time are curiosity and keenness to get acquainted with more prevalence data. Thank you for listening.